She tore the veil from her own head with shaking hands, stuffed it under the bed, and ran. Not away from love, away from a man who had already paid for her silence. Eleanor Whitfield had exactly 8 minutes before they noticed she was gone. 8 minutes to outrun a life that had never belonged to her. If you've ever felt like someone else was writing your story without asking your permission, this one's for you. Subscribe, follow every part to the end, and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far Eleanor's story travels. The wedding dress was still warm from her body when Eleanor Whitfield dropped it on the floor of her childhood bedroom and stepped over it like it was already a grave marker. She did not look back at it. Her fingers were shaking so badly she could barely work the buttons on the dark traveling dress she'd hidden behind the winter coats 3 days earlier. 3 days after Mrs. Abigail Reed had pressed a folded note into her palm during breakfast and whispered, "Read it alone, child. Read it and don't scream." Eleanor had read it alone. She had not screamed. She had sat very still on the edge of her bed for a long time, the note flat across her knees, and she had done what the women in her family had always done when the world collapsed beneath them. She had thought clearly. She had made a plan. The note was in Mrs. Reed's handwriting. Careful slanted letters, the kind a woman writes when she is afraid, but determined not to show it. Eleanor, your uncle has accepted payment from Nathaniel Crow. Not a dowry. Payment. The arrangement is not a marriage. After the ceremony, Crow intends to petition the court for a competency hearing. Dr. Harlan Morse has already been engaged to provide testimony. They will declare you unfit. They will send you to the Beaumont Private Institution. Your mother's trust, all of it, will transfer to Crow's control within 60 days. I have seen the letters. I have held them in my hands. You must not be in that church on Saturday. Whatever you must do, do not be in that church. Below the signature in smaller letters, almost an afterthought. Forgive me for not telling you sooner. I was afraid. I am still afraid. But not as afraid as I am of watching them bury you alive. That had been Wednesday. Today was Saturday. The church bells had begun ringing 20 minutes ago. Eleanor worked the last button on her dress and pressed her ear to the bedroom door. Voices in the corridor, 2 maids moving quickly toward the south staircase, carrying something that rustled. They were bringing up the flowers for her hair. She had perhaps 5 minutes before someone came to dress her, perhaps less. She crossed to the window. 3 hired men stood at the front of the estate talking with her uncle's groundskeeper. 2 more were visible near the stable gate. Silas Whitfield had positioned them carefully not to keep danger out. Eleanor understood now, but to keep her in. She turned from the window without letting herself feel the full weight of what that meant. The servants' passage ran behind the east wall of the house, through the laundry room, and out through a low door beside the kitchen garden. Eleanor had used it as a child when she wanted to reach the orchard without being followed. She had not used it in 15 years. She was counting on everyone having forgotten that she knew it existed. She picked up the small leather bag she'd packed the night before. Clean linen, her mother's pearl brooch, $40 in coins she'd quietly withdrawn from the household accounts over the past month, and the note from Mrs. Reed folded to the size of a calling card. And she walked to the door, opened it 2 inches, listened, opened it the rest of the way, and stepped into the corridor. She did not run. Running would draw attention. She walked the way she'd been taught to walk, steadily, chin up, like a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be. At the top of the servants' stair, she heard her uncle's voice below, speaking to someone she didn't recognize. Low, satisfied tones. The voice of a man who believed everything was already settled. She'll be calm enough once the ceremony's done. Women always are. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She descended the back staircase without making a sound. The kitchen garden was half in shade, the morning sun still low and thick with summer heat. Eleanor moved along the wall toward the lane that ran east of the property, where the road to the church cut through a line of old elms. She had no plan beyond getting to that road. She had no one waiting for her. She had a leather bag, $40, a pearl brooch that had belonged to a woman who died believing the law would protect her daughter, and 8 minutes. She reached the lane and turned east, away from the church, away from the sound of the bells, and walked fast, keeping close to the hedgerow. The road was beginning to fill. Carriages and horses were arriving from the north. Guests come to witness the union of Eleanor Whitfield and Nathaniel Crowe, magistrate of Fredericksburg County, a man who had already paid for her and was merely waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. None of them looked at her. A woman in a plain dark dress on a summer morning, walking purposefully. She was a maid on an errand, a housekeeper running late. Nobody worth a second glance. Eleanor had spent her entire life being underestimated by people who looked at the surface of things. For the first time, it was useful. She was past the elm line and nearly to the crossroads when she heard the horses. Not arriving horses. Searching horses. She could tell the difference. A different rhythm in the canter. A purposeful urgency that had nothing to do with reaching a church on time. She looked back. 2 men on horseback coming fast along the lane she'd just left. Eleanor looked forward. The crossroads was 40 yards ahead. Past it, a line of carriages had pulled off the road to water their horses at the trough beside Hester Calloway's old feed barn. 6 or 7 carriages at least, drivers and horses and movement. She ran. She was not graceful about it. She ran hard and fast, the leather bag knocking against her hip, and she hit the crossroads and cut left toward the carriages, without slowing, and she was scanning desperately quickly for any door that wasn't latched. Any carriage whose driver was standing away from it. Any dark interior she could fold herself into before the men on horseback came around the bend. The third carriage from the end. Large. Dark green paint, somewhat dusty from travel. The driver had climbed down and was talking with the man from the carriage behind, gesturing toward one of the horse's back legs, some concern about a shoe from the look of it. The carriage door was on the far side away from both men. Eleanor did not let herself think about whose it was or where it was going. She went around the back of the carriage, opened the door with both hands, and climbed in. The interior was dark and smelled of leather and wood smoke, and something clean cedar maybe, or good soap. There was a leather document case on the seat and a folded traveling coat, and on the floor beneath the forward-facing seat a narrow space. Not large, but large enough. Eleanor pushed the document case aside, dropped to the floor, pulled the traveling coat down over herself, and lay still. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the horses outside. She heard the 2 men come around the bend. She heard them slow, heard them talking, asking the drivers at the trough whether they'd seen a woman on foot, dark dress, brown hair, traveling alone. One of the drivers said he hadn't noticed. Another said the same. Eleanor pressed her face against the floor of the carriage and breathed as slowly as she could manage and did not move. A long silence. Then the sound of hooves moving on continuing east. Eleanor closed her eyes. She lay there for what felt like a long time, listening to the sounds outside shift and settle. The drivers returning to their seats, the horses being readied. She heard the carriage she was in move slightly as the driver climbed back up. Then the carriage began to roll. She had no idea where it was going. She kept the coat over her and stayed still and thought about her mother, who had trusted the law and the family and the careful arrangements of men with good names, and who had died with her fortune, perfectly intact and perfectly out of reach. Eleanor thought about the note folded in her bag and the careful slanted handwriting of a woman who had been afraid, but written anyway. You must not be in that church. She wasn't. She didn't know how long they traveled. The road was rough in places and smooth in others, and the summer heat built steadily inside the carriage until the air felt close and thick. At some point, Eleanor allowed herself to shift slightly enough to breathe more easily. She kept the coat over her. She did not sleep, but she drifted a kind of hollow stillness that wasn't rest and wasn't waking. The carriage slowed. Then it stopped. She heard the driver climb down, heard him call to someone, a groom by the sound of it, heard the sounds of a yard horses being led a gate. Then the carriage door opened. Eleanor pulled the coat tighter. I can see you breathing, said a voice. It was a man's voice. Not the driver's lower, more deliberate, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard without raising it. Not unkind exactly, but not gentle either. The voice of a man who did not have much patience for indirection. Eleanor did not move. "I'm not going to pretend I haven't noticed you," the voice said, "and you don't have to pretend you aren't there. But I would appreciate it if we could speak plainly, because I've been traveling since before dawn, and I haven't eaten, and I'd like to understand what's happening before I decide what to do about it." A beat of silence. "Ma'am," he added. Eleanor pushed the coat back slowly and looked up. He was standing outside the open carriage door, one hand on the frame. Tall, dark-coated, with the kind of face that had spent time in weather, not young, not old, somewhere in the middle years, that life tends to cut the softness out of. His eyes were steady and dark. He was looking at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, and not quite irritation, and not quite concern, but somewhere among all three. Eleanor sat up. She did not apologize. "How long have you known I was here?" she asked. "Since Calloway's Crossroads," he said. She absorbed that. He'd known for the entire journey and had said nothing. She wasn't sure what to do with that information. "Are you going to send me back?" she asked. Something moved in his expression. Not softness, more like a recalibration. "Back where?" he said. "To the Whitfield estate, or to the men who were searching for me, or to the church." His eyes didn't change. "You fled a church." "I fled a transaction," Eleanor said. "There was a church involved, but that was incidental." He was quiet for a moment, studying her, not in the way that Nathaniel Crowe studied her, like something being assessed for value, but something more careful than that. More considered. "My name is James Ashford," he said. "I own land outside Baltimore. I'm not connected to anyone in Fredericksburg County that I'm aware of, and I have no particular interest in returning women to transactions they've fled." A pause. "But I'd like to know who you are." Eleanor looked at him. She had been taught that honesty was a luxury available mainly to people who had nothing to lose. She was currently lying on the floor of a stranger's carriage with $40 and a pearl brooch between herself and complete destitution. She could not afford the truth. Not yet. "My name is Eleanor," she said. "I was employed as a companion in a household where the situation became untenable. I left this morning. I have money and I intend to seek respectable employment elsewhere. I apologize for entering your carriage without permission. I will leave as soon as you tell me where we are." James Ashford looked at her for a long moment. "You speak like a woman who was raised in a house considerably larger than a companion's quarters," he said. Eleanor said nothing. "And your hands," he said without pointing, "are not the hands of a working woman." Eleanor looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "Mr. Ashford," she said quietly, "I am asking you not to send me back. Whatever else you choose not to believe, please believe that. I am asking you plainly, without pretense, not to send me back." The summer air was still and heavy. Somewhere in the stable yard behind him, a horse moved and was quiet. James Ashford looked at her for a moment longer. Then he stepped back from the carriage door and held out his hand. "Come inside," he said. "You can eat something. Then we'll talk." Eleanor took his hand and climbed down from the carriage. She did not know where she was. She did not know if she was safe. But for the first time since Wednesday, when she had read the note with shaking hands and sat very still on the edge of her bed, she was not running. That was something. That was, she thought, gripping the leather bag against her side, following a stranger across his own yard in the thick heat of a Virginia summer, that might be the first step toward something that wasn't a grave. She didn't know his name well enough yet to know if she was right, but she followed him anyway. And somewhere behind her in a church she would never stand inside a magistrate named Nathaniel Crowe was standing at the altar, waiting for a woman who was already gone. He didn't know it yet. He would. The kitchen at Ashford Hall was quieter than Eleanor expected. She had anticipated something cold, a formal room, a housekeeper who would look at her the way women in good households looked at unexpected arrivals, with that particular combination of suspicion and pity that was somehow worse than open hostility. She had anticipated being seated somewhere out of the way and handed tea she didn't ask for, while someone decided what to do with her. Instead, James Ashford pulled out a chair at the long work table in the center of the kitchen, set a plate of bread and cold chicken in front of her himself, and sat down across from her with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man prepared to wait as long as necessary. The housekeeper, a solid woman named Mrs. Clara Greer, who had introduced herself with the brisk efficiency of someone who had managed difficult situations before and expected to manage them again, had taken one look at Eleanor and gone to heat water without being asked. She hadn't said anything about the traveling dress or the leather bag or the fact that Eleanor's hair was coming down in the back. Eleanor was grateful for that. She ate. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her, and then she had to make a conscious effort not to eat too quickly, not to let him see the full shape of how frightened and exhausted and entirely at the mercy of his goodwill she actually was. James watched her without watching her. She had the sense of a man who was observant enough to notice everything and disciplined enough not to make a performance of it. When she'd eaten enough to think clearly, he set down his cup. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. "You're going to ask me anyway," Eleanor said, "whether I give you permission or not." The corner of his mouth moved. "Fair enough. The men who were searching for you at the crossroads, were they law?" "No." "Hired?" "Yes." "By whom?" Eleanor set down her bread. She looked at her hands on the table, the hands he'd noticed, the ones that gave her away. Her mother's hands, long-fingered, pale, unmarked by the kind of work that left a record on a person. "By my uncle," she said carefully, "and by the man my uncle arranged for me to marry this morning." James was quiet for a moment. "Arranged without your consent. Arranged in exchange for payment. To settle debts my uncle accumulated over the past 4 years at card tables in Richmond and Philadelphia." She looked up at him. "I am not a companion, Mr. Ashford. I apologize for that. I was raised in the Whitfield household in Fredericksburg County. My father died when I was 14. My mother died 2 years ago. She left me a substantial trust. That trust is the reason Nathaniel Crowe wanted to marry me." She watched him absorb it. His expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes shifted, a reassessment, she thought. A recalibration of the picture. "Nathaniel Crowe," he said. "The magistrate. You know him?" "I know of him. He has a reputation in certain commercial circles." He picked up his cup, looked at it, set it down again. "Not a favorable one." "No," Eleanor said. "I don't imagine it is." Another silence. Mrs. Greer moved quietly at the far end of the kitchen, doing something with purpose that kept her back turned, a woman who understood that some conversations required the courtesy of not being listened to. "There's more," Eleanor said. "There's a reason I couldn't simply leave after the ceremony, or contest the marriage legally afterward. My uncle and Crowe have arranged for a physician, a Dr. Harlan Morse, to provide testimony in a competency hearing. After the wedding, Crowe intended to have me declared unfit. They planned to send me to the Beaumont institution." She said it evenly, because that was the only way she could say it at all. "My mother's trust would transfer to Crowe's control. My uncle would receive a percentage. I would be removed." James looked at her for a long moment. "How do you know this?" he asked. "My former governess, Mrs. Abigail Reed. She found the letters. She wrote to warn me." "Where is Mrs. Reed now?" "I don't know." That was the thing that sat in Eleanor's chest like a cold stone. She had gotten out. She did not know if Mrs. Reed had. "She was no longer employed at the estate at the time she wrote to me. I don't know where she went or whether my uncle, whether she's safe." Something crossed James Ashford's face then. It wasn't pity. Eleanor had spent enough time around men offering pity to recognize it on sight. And this wasn't it. It was something harder and quieter than pity, closer to recognition, or to anger, kept very still. "How long ago did she send the letter?" he asked. 3 days ago." He nodded slowly. Then he stood up from the table. "You'll stay here," he said. "I have a guest room. Mrs. Greer will see to it. I need to think about several things, and I can't think about them clearly until I know more. I have a contact in Baltimore, an attorney named Samuel Pruitt. I'm going to write to him today." Eleanor stared at him. "You believe me? I believe enough of what you've told me to want to know the rest." He picked up his cup and carried it toward the window. "And I don't return women to men who've paid for them. I want to be clear about that. Whatever else you're uncertain of, I want you to be clear on that point." Eleanor looked at him, at the back of him, the straight line of his shoulders, the particular set of a man who had made a decision and was done negotiating with himself about it. She had walked into that carriage with $40 and no plan, and more fear than she'd ever carried in her life. She had not expected this. She hadn't let herself expect anything, because expectation was a door, and doors could be closed in your face. And she had learned at a young age not to stand too close to doors that other people controlled. But she looked at James Ashford standing at that window, and she thought carefully and quietly that this was either the best thing that had happened to her since Wednesday or the beginning of something she didn't yet have the shape of. She picked up the rest of her bread and finished it. She was going to need her strength either way. The guest room was clean and simply furnished, and it faced east. And when Eleanor woke the next morning, the summer sun was already coming hard through the curtains, and she lay still for a full minute before she remembered where she was and why. And then she sat up and put her feet on the floor and got on with it. She was not by nature a woman who collapsed. She had learned that about herself 2 years ago, when her mother died in the blue bedroom at the end of the upstairs hall. And Eleanor had sat with her through the night. And in the morning she had risen and gone downstairs and organized the household for the arrival of the family. And she had not fallen apart until 2 weeks later, alone in the kitchen garden in the rain, when she'd finally allowed herself 5 minutes of it before deciding she was done. 5 minutes was all she'd had. The world didn't grant extensions. She dressed, put her hair up as neatly as she could manage without a proper mirror, and went downstairs to find Mrs. Greer already at work, and a cup of tea waiting at the end of the work table, as if it had been expected. "Mr. Ashford rode out early," Mrs. Greer said without turning around. "He'll be back by midday. He said to tell you that you have the run of the house, and that he'd appreciate your help with the East study if you were willing. There are 3 years of correspondence that need organizing." Eleanor looked at the tea. He said that. He said the correspondence was a disaster, and that anyone with an organized mind would be doing him a genuine service. Mrs. Greer turned around and looked at her with the direct, calibrated gaze of a woman who had worked for James Ashford long enough to have strong opinions about him. "He means it. He's not a man who says things he doesn't mean. You'll learn that quickly enough." Eleanor picked up the tea. "He trusts me in his study. He trusts his judgment about people," Mrs. Greer said. "He's usually right. The few times he's been wrong, it cost him considerably, and he doesn't make the same mistake twice." She turned back to her work. "The study is the second door on the left at the top of the stairs. I'd start with the stacks on the right side of the desk. Those are oldest." Eleanor went to the study. It was exactly the disaster Mrs. Greer had described. Papers everywhere, stacked and folded and laid out across every flat surface, in no order she could immediately identify. Correspondence, contracts, shipping manifests. Deeds, receipts. Letters, personal and professional. All of it accumulated with the systematic neglect of a man who was very efficient at generating paperwork and entirely uninterested in filing it. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at it. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She worked for 3 hours before she found the letter. It was tucked inside a folded shipping contract from 2 years prior, and it was addressed to James Ashford, in a hand she did not recognize. And she would not have read it at all, except that it had been left open unsealed, and it fell out of the contract and into her hands, and the first line caught her eye before she could stop it. "James, I am sorry to tell you this by letter, but I cannot come in person. Margaret has been gone 4 months, and I still cannot find the right words, so I will use the only ones I have. She did not deserve what happened, and you did not cause it, whatever you are telling yourself, in that house alone." Eleanor stopped reading. She refolded the letter carefully, set it aside with the contract, and continued working. But the name stayed with her. Margaret. And the particular weight of the word gone, not dead, not past, but gone, as if she had simply ceased, as if the fact of her absence was still too large to look at directly. James Ashford had been married. She had assumed as much. The house had the feeling of a place that had once had more life in it, a fullness that was now hollowed out, maintained, but not quite inhabited. But she had not asked, and he had not offered, and she was acutely aware that she was in his house on his good will, and had already told him enough of her own troubles without soliciting his. She worked until noon. He came back at 12:30 with the look of a man who had covered a lot of ground quickly and was thinking hard about what he'd learned. Eleanor was back in the kitchen by then, helping Mrs. Greer shell beans at the work table, less because she needed something to do, and more because the kitchen felt safer than the study, which felt too much like his private space, and she was trying to be careful about how much of it she occupied. James came in through the back door, set his hat on the hook, and looked at her. "I sent the letter to Pruitt," he said. "I also made 2 inquiries in town. I know someone who knows Fredericksburg County, and I wanted to understand the scope of what you're dealing with." He sat down across from her. "Nathaniel Crow filed a report this morning. He's telling people you suffered a mental episode at the estate before the ceremony and fled in a state of confusion. He's expressing concern for your welfare." Eleanor set down the beans. "Of course he is. He's already contacted the county court regarding your uncle's guardianship. He's arguing that as you're intended, he has a civic interest in your safe return." James's voice was level, but there was something underneath it, a controlled anger, the kind that had been reasoned with and was being kept back. "He has not yet mentioned the trust publicly, but Pruitt believes that's the next move. He'll wait until he has me," Eleanor said. "If he gets me back before the competency petition, the marriage can still proceed. He only needs the petition if I remain free." James looked at her. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've thought about nothing else for 3 days." She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "Mr. Ashford, I need you to understand something. I am not confused. I am not unfit. I am not hysterical or fragile or any of the other things that men like Nathaniel Crow say about women when those women know something inconvenient." Her voice was steady. She made sure of it. "My mother was a woman of considerable intelligence and a sound mind, and she trusted men with good names and careful manners, and she died with nothing she'd intended to keep. I am not going to do the same." Something shifted in James Ashford's face. Not pity, not condescension. Respect, she thought. Careful, reserved, not yet fully offered, but there. "No," he said quietly. "I don't believe you are." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Pruitt is going to make inquiries about Crow on the legal side, but I also need to find Mrs. Reed. If she has the letters, the physical letters, that's evidence. Without her, what you have is your word against a magistrate with a court connection and a physician already engaged." "I know," Eleanor said. "Do you know where she might have gone after she left the Whitfield estate?" Eleanor thought. She had a sister in Richmond, a Mrs. Grace Holloway. They weren't close, but they wrote. If Mrs. Reed needed somewhere to go quickly— "Richmond," James said. He stood up. "I'm going to write to Pruitt again this afternoon. I'm also going to write to a contact in Richmond who can make a discreet inquiry." He looked at her. "In the meantime, you stay here. You don't go to the road. You don't speak to anyone arriving at the gate without telling me first. Not because I don't trust you, but because Crow has resources, and he will use them, and right now, the fact that you're here is the only advantage you have." Eleanor looked up at him. "You haven't asked me if I want to fight him." "No," James said simply. "I assumed." She stared at him. "Was I wrong?" he said. "No," she said. "You were not wrong." He nodded once and went to write his letters. 4 days passed. They were strange days, suspended, charged with a kind of quiet tension that hummed beneath everything like the heat outside. Eleanor organized the East Study. She helped Mrs. Greer with the household accounts when the housekeeper allowed it, which was not often because Mrs. Greer had strong opinions about her domain. She read in the evenings from James's library, which was extensive and unexpectedly varied, not just the practical volumes of law and commerce she'd expected, but history, philosophy. A worn collection of English poetry with handwritten notes in the margins, in a hand she recognized as his. James worked. He was up before dawn and in motion until after dark, managing the business of a large estate, with the focused efficiency of a man who had trained himself to find work preferable to stillness. He ate dinner across from her, and they talked carefully at first. Then less carefully, the way two people begin to talk when they have been placed in proximity by circumstance and discover with some surprise that the other person is worth listening to. He told her on the third evening about Margaret. Not much. Not the way a man talks when he has processed his grief and found a shape for it. More the way a man talks when he is tired and his guard is slightly lower than he intends, and the subject comes up sideways and he decides against his usual judgment not to deflect it. She was ill, he said, for 2 years before she died. I thought I believed for a long time that I could manage it. That the right physicians, the right arrangements would be enough. He looked at his coffee cup. They weren't. Eleanor didn't say she was sorry. She'd been on the receiving end of enough reflexive condolences to know they mostly served the person offering them rather than the one receiving them. How long ago? She said. 3 years this October. Do you blame yourself? She asked. He looked up at her slightly startled, not by the question itself, she thought, but by the directness of it. Yes, he said. Are you right to? A pause. Probably not entirely. No, Eleanor said. Probably not. They sat with that for a moment. My mother trusted men who told her everything was managed, Eleanor said. She spent 30 years being grateful for arrangements she never examined. And she died grateful, which is the thing I cannot, which is the thing I don't want for myself. She looked at him. I am not criticizing her. She did what she was taught, but I would rather make my own mistakes than be managed into someone else's. James looked at her for a long time. Yes, he said finally. I can see that about you. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like recognition, an acknowledgement of something real. She found she valued it more than a compliment would have been. On the 5th morning, a reply came from Samuel Pruitt. James read it at the breakfast table, and Eleanor watched his expression shift in a way it hadn't shifted before. Not alarm, but a hardening, a tightening around the jaw that meant the information was worse than he'd expected. He set the letter down. Pruitt has confirmed the trust, he said. Your mother's estate, the full amount, is held in trust until your 28th birthday, at which point it transfers to you outright. You turn 28 in September. He paused. Crow knew. His petition for competency was going to be filed before September. If it had succeeded, the trust would have been directed to his control as your legal custodian indefinitely. Eleanor felt it land. Not surprise, she'd known the shape of it. But hearing it confirmed, hearing the mechanics of it laid out plainly in someone else's words was different from reading it in a governess's letter at 2 a.m. There's more, James said. He looked at her steadily. Pruitt found a record. Nathaniel Crow's first wife, a woman named Louise Prentice, married in 1811, died in 1813. She was 24. The official record lists fever. But there are notes in the county physician's record that were never formally reported. He paused. She had been at the Beaumont Institution for 6 months before she died. The kitchen went very quiet. He's done this before, Eleanor said. That's what Pruitt believes. He can't prove it yet, but Louise Prentice had a family estate in Culpeper County. That estate transferred to Crow 6 weeks after her death. James's voice was level, controlled. You were not his first opportunity, Eleanor. You were his second. Eleanor looked at the table. She thought about Louise Prentice, 24 years old, at the Beaumont Institution for 6 months. She thought about what those 6 months had looked like. She thought about a woman who had trusted the law and the family and the careful arrangements of men with good names. She thought about her mother. She looked up. I want to find Mrs. Reed, she said, and I want to take this to court. James looked at her. Crow has connections in the Fredericksburg court, he said. It would need to be a different jurisdiction. Baltimore, possibly. Then Baltimore, Eleanor said. Whatever it takes. Whatever we need to prove it. She met his eyes directly. I am not going to disappear, Mr. Ashford. I am not going to let him bury this so he can find a third woman in 2 years and do it again." James Ashford was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a reply from Richmond." Eleanor went still. He picked up a second letter from the table. She hadn't noticed. It hadn't seen it beneath Pruitt's, and held it out to her. She took it with steady hands and read it. It was brief. 2 paragraphs. A contact of James's in Richmond writing to say that a woman matching the description of Abigail Reed had been located at the home of a Mrs. Grace Holloway on Merchant Street. She was safe. She was in possession of documents she had taken from the Whitfield estate on the morning of Eleanor's departure, believing they would be needed. She was willing to come to Baltimore. She was asking only one question before she agreed to travel. Eleanor read the question. "Is Miss Whitfield safe? Tell me she is safe and I will come." Eleanor set the letter down. She pressed her hands flat against the table and held them there until they were steady, and then she looked up at James Ashford and said in a voice that was entirely calm, "She has the letters." "Yes," he said. "She took them, before she left. She knew she'd need them." Eleanor stopped. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "She was afraid and she took them anyway." "Yes," James said more quietly. Eleanor looked at the letter again, at the small, careful question written at the bottom of the page. "Is Miss Whitfield safe?" "Tell him yes," she said. "Tell him to bring her here." James was already reaching for paper. "I had a feeling you'd say that," he said. And for the first time since she'd dropped her wedding dress on the floor of her childhood bedroom and stepped over it like a grave marker, Eleanor Whitfield felt something loosen in her chest. Not safety, not yet. Not resolution, but the first thin thread of something that might eventually become both. Outside the kitchen window, the summer heat pressed against the glass, relentless and familiar. She was not running anymore. She was building something. She did not yet know what it would cost her to finish it, but she intended to find out. Mrs. Abigail Reed arrived at Ashford Hall on a Tuesday afternoon, 7 days after Eleanor had climbed out of that carriage covered in dust and fear and the particular kind of desperation that makes a person either break or sharpen. She was smaller than Eleanor remembered. That was the first thing. Memory had a way of enlarging the people who mattered to you, filling them out with the size of what they meant, and Mrs. Reed in Eleanor's memory was a solid, certain presence. The woman who had taught her French and figures, and the proper way to write a letter, and the improper way to read one, which was to say thoroughly and without guilt. The woman standing in the front hall of Ashford Hall was small and gray-haired and tired, in a way that went past the body into something deeper, the tiredness of a person who has been afraid for a long time and has not yet been given permission to stop. Eleanor crossed the hall and took both her hands. "You came," Eleanor said. Mrs. Reed looked at her, really looked at her the way she had when Eleanor was 12, and had lied about practicing her letters, that same direct, searching look that never missed anything. "Of course I came," she said. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought they might have stopped you. They tried." Mrs. Reed's chin lifted. "Mr. Whitfield sent a man to Grace's house 3 days after I arrived. Told her I'd stolen property from the estate, and he wanted me back." Her eyes were steady. "Grace told him I'd left for Philadelphia. She's a better liar than anyone gives her credit for." Eleanor squeezed her hands. "Are you all right?" "I'm tired, and my back aches from the carriage, and I haven't slept properly in 2 weeks." Mrs. Reed looked past Eleanor's shoulder to where James Ashford stood in the doorway to the hall, watching quietly. "Is that him?" "Yes." Mrs. Reed studied him for a moment with the same calibrating look she'd applied to Eleanor. Then she said at a volume she clearly intended him to hear, "He looks like a man who means what he says." "He does," Eleanor said. "Good." Mrs. Reed released her hands and reached into the bag over her arm. "Then let's not waste time. I've been carrying these for 11 days, and I'd like to put them down somewhere safe." She produced a folded oilskin packet, thick with papers tied with a piece of kitchen twine. Eleanor looked at it. "That's everything," she said. "That's everything," Mrs. Reed said. 3 letters from Crow to your uncle, 2 from Dr. Morse, 1 from someone at the Beaumont Institution confirming arrangements for a new patient, unnamed, arriving in September. She held it out. I took them the morning I left. I went into your uncle's study at 5 in the morning while he was still asleep, and I took them, and I walked out the back gate. A pause. I was shaking so badly I dropped my bag twice. You were afraid, Eleanor said. Terrified, Mrs. Reed said simply. But I took them anyway. Someone had to. James stepped forward from the doorway. Mrs. Reed, I'm grateful you're here. May I? She handed him the packet without hesitation. He untied it carefully, opened it, and began to read. His expression didn't change dramatically, but Eleanor had spent enough time watching him by now to read the smaller shifts, the almost imperceptible tightening around his mouth, that meant what he was reading was worse than he'd anticipated, and the particular stillness that settled over him when something moved him and he was choosing not to show it. He read through all 6 documents. Then he looked up. This is enough, he said. This is more than enough. Samuel Pruitt arrived from Baltimore the following morning. He was a compact, quick-moving man of about 50, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the particular manner of an attorney who had spent decades being underestimated and had learned to use it. He shook Eleanor's hand when they were introduced, not the careful, minimal handshake men sometimes offered women, but a real one, firm and direct. And he sat down at the table in James's study and read through the documents twice before he said a single word. Then he said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning, every detail, however small." Eleanor told him. She had told the story before to James in pieces over the course of 5 days. But telling it to Pruitt was different. Pruitt asked questions. Precise, specific questions that cut to the structure of things, when exactly in what order, who was present, who could confirm. He took notes in a small, dense hand, and he did not offer sympathy or reassurance, and Eleanor found she respected that enormously. She didn't need reassurance. She needed someone who was paying attention. When she finished, Pruitt looked at his notes for a moment. The Morse connection is significant, he said. Dr. Harlan Morse has testified in 3 competency hearings in Fredericksburg County in the past 4 years. All 3 resulted in commitment. All 3 of the committed individuals were women with property interests. He looked up. 2 of those cases involved attorneys connected to Crow's firm. The room was very quiet. He has a system, James said. He has a practice, Pruitt said with the precision of a man who chose his words carefully. Whether it rises to conspiracy under law depends on what we can prove and how quickly. He looked at Eleanor. Miss Whitfield, your trust transfers to you on your 28th birthday. That is, September 14th, Eleanor said. 7 weeks. Pruitt set down his pen. Crow's petition for competency will need to be filed and heard before that date if it's going to accomplish what he intends. He knows that. Which means he will move quickly once he locates you. And he will locate you. Men like this have resources, and you have been missing for nearly 2 weeks. Then we move first, James said. Pruitt looked at him. I'd welcome your thoughts, James. We file in Baltimore court. We file a petition to affirm Miss Whitfield's legal competency and her right to her trust. We file it before he can file in Fredericksburg. We make the letters part of the record. We make Louise Prentice part of the record. His voice was steady. And we make sure that every judge in this state has the opportunity to understand what Nathaniel Crow has been doing to women who had the misfortune of having something he wanted. Pruitt tapped his pen against the table twice. There is one complication. Say it, Eleanor said. Your uncle retains legal guardianship over you until you marry or reach the age specified in your father's estate documents, which is 28, the same date as the trust. Pruitt met her eyes. As your guardian, Silas Whitfield can file a counterpetition in any jurisdiction arguing that you are in the unlawful custody of a third party. He can also, and I believe he will argue that James harboring you without family consent constitutes interference with guardianship. James said very calmly, what would remove his guardianship before September? Pruitt looked at him. A silence stretched between the 2 men that Eleanor felt more than heard. Marriage would remove it, Pruitt said. If Miss Whitfield were to marry before September, guardianship transfers to her husband by law. Her uncle's claim dissolves. Crow's petition loses its legal foundation because a husband's competency filing would supersede a former guardian's claim, and no husband is going to file that his own wife be committed. The room held still. Eleanor looked at James. James was looking at Pruitt, but Eleanor could see the side of his face, the set of his jaw, the careful quality of his stillness. "I see," he said. "I'm not suggesting anything," Pruitt said in the tone of a man who is absolutely suggesting something. "I'm describing the legal landscape." "I understand," James said. He stood up. "Give me until tomorrow morning." Pruitt nodded and closed his notebook. Eleanor said nothing. She said nothing because the thing that needed to be said next was not hers to say first, and she was old enough and had been through enough to know the difference between a moment that required her voice and a moment that required her patience. She would wait. She was very good at waiting. What she was less good at, she was discovering, was pretending she didn't feel the particular quality of the silence James Ashford left behind him when he walked out of a room. He came to find her that evening. She was in the garden behind the kitchen, not because she particularly wanted to be outside in the thick summer heat, but because the house felt too small for both of them suddenly, and she needed air that didn't carry the weight of the afternoon. She heard him come up behind her and did not turn around. "You've been thinking," he said. "Haven't stopped," she said. He came to stand beside her. Not too close. James Ashford was a man who maintained careful distances she had learned. He occupied his own space with precision and rarely entered anyone else's without reason. "I want to say something," he said. "And I want you to let me say it completely before you respond." "All right," Eleanor said. "I am not going to tell you that you must marry me. I am not going to tell you that it's the only option, or that you have no choice, or that it's been decided. Those things would not be true, and I don't say things that aren't true." He paused. "I am going to tell you that I am willing, that it would be a marriage of protection, legal formal, and as limited in scope as you require, that I would not make demands on you beyond what you consent to, and that if at any point after September you wish to—" He stopped, recalibrated. "That the arrangement could be whatever you needed it to be." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she said. "Because what they are trying to do to you is wrong," he said. "And because I have resources that could stop it, and because—" He stopped again. "Go on," Eleanor said. "Because I have spent 3 years running this house and this estate, and being very efficient and very alone, and somewhere in the past 2 weeks I have become accustomed to hearing another person's voice at breakfast." His voice stayed level, but something underneath it shifted. "I am not going to make that into something it isn't. You're in a desperate situation, and I'm aware of that, and I would not want you to feel that my willingness is conditional on anything more than I want to help you. That's the truth of it. I want to help you, and this is the most effective way I know how." Eleanor turned and looked at him. He was looking straight ahead with the expression of a man who had said what he intended to say and was waiting for the result. "James," she said. He looked at her. "I'm going to say yes," she said. "But I want you to know that I'm saying yes because I trust you. Not because I'm desperate, though I am desperate. Not because I have no other choice, though my choices are limited. Because in 2 weeks you have not once looked at me the way Nathaniel Crow looked at me. You have not once spoken to me the way my uncle speaks to women. And that—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "That is rarer than you might think." James looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said quietly. "That shouldn't be rare." "No," she said. "It shouldn't." They stood in the summer heat for a moment side by side. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. They married the next morning in a small chapel 2 miles from Ashford Hall, with Samuel Pruitt and Mrs. Abigail Reed as witnesses, and Mrs. Greer waiting at the house with breakfast and the expression of a woman who had suspected this was coming for at least a week. The ceremony was brief. The minister, a man named Reverend Cole, who had known James for 15 years and asked very few questions, performed it with quiet dignity. Eleanor wore her dark traveling dress because it was the only dress she had. James wore his plain coat and looked exactly like himself, steady, direct, present. When Reverend Cole asked if she consented freely, Eleanor said yes clearly and without hesitation, and meant it in a way she had never imagined, meaning it. When James said the words, he said them to her face, looking directly at her, and his voice didn't waver. They signed the register. Pruitt witnessed both signatures with the focused satisfaction of a man who had just removed a significant legal obstacle and was already thinking about the next one. Mrs. Reed cried quietly into her handkerchief, which she denied afterward. They rode back to Ashford Hall, and for approximately 4 hours, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that the hard part might be over. The riders arrived at Ashford Hall at 3:30 in the afternoon. Eleanor heard them from the study where she and Pruitt were going over the filing documents, and something in the rhythm of hooves, too many, too fast, too purposeful, made her set down her pen before she consciously understood why. She heard James's voice downstairs, then another voice, loud, not bothering to be polite about it. She knew that voice. She had last heard it telling someone at a dinner party that women of Eleanor's type benefited greatly from firm guidance. Silas Whitfield. She stood up. Pruitt put a hand on the documents on the table. "Stay here." "No," Eleanor said, and walked out of the study. She came to the top of the stairs. Her uncle was standing in the front hall of Ashford Hall, red-faced, sweating from the summer heat, and from the particular exertion of a man who believes himself profoundly wronged. Behind him stood 2 men she didn't recognize, and one she did, Nathaniel Crow, standing a half-step back, letting Silas be loud while he watched everything with those flat assessing eyes that had never once in Eleanor's memory conveyed anything resembling warmth. James was at the base of the stairs. He had not stepped back. "You will return her immediately," Silas was saying. "She is my ward. She is ill. This man has taken advantage of a woman in a fragile state, and I will have the law on him before sundown if she is not in my custody within the hour." "She's not your ward," James said. His voice was completely calm. "She was married this morning. Her guardianship transferred at the time of the ceremony. Whatever claim you held ended 3 hours ago." Silas stared at him. Then he looked up and saw Eleanor at the top of the stairs. "Eleanor." His voice shifted, less blustering now, more dangerous in the quiet way of a man recalculating. "Come down here. This man has manipulated you. You don't understand what you've done." "I understand precisely what I've done," Eleanor said. She came down the stairs. She kept her eyes on Nathaniel Crow, not her uncle. Crow was the one whose expression mattered. Crow was the one she needed to read. He was watching her with something she could only describe as fury. Carefully contained fury that had nowhere to go yet, because he was still working out whether there was a move left to make. "The marriage is invalid," Crow said. His voice was smooth. He had the voice of a man who had practiced being convincing. "You are not competent to consent. We have a physician's affidavit." "Filed where?" Pruitt said from behind Eleanor on the stairs. Crow looked up at him. "Samuel Pruitt," Pruitt said pleasantly, coming down 2 steps. "Attorney Baltimore. And you would be making a significant legal error, Mr. Crow, if you attempt to use an unfiled affidavit to contest a marriage that has already been registered with the county. In Baltimore County. This morning." He smiled without warmth. "We anticipated your timeline." Crow's expression went very still. "Furthermore," Pruitt continued, "we have filed in Baltimore court also this morning a petition documenting the details of the arrangement between yourself and Mr. Silas Whitfield, including the correspondence regarding Miss Whitfield's trust, the arrangements made with Dr. Harlan Morse, and the institutional arrangements at the Beaumont facility." He paused. "We also filed a supplemental document regarding the estate of Louise Prentice Crow. The court found it relevant." The name fell into the room like a stone into still water. Crow did not move. But something happened behind his eyes, a rapid, terrible recalculation. Eleanor watched it happen and felt no satisfaction. She felt something colder than satisfaction. She felt the particular chill of a person who has confirmed their worst suspicions and been proven right. "You have no evidence," Crow said. "We have 6 letters," James said. 3 of them in your handwriting." Silas made a sound something between a curse and an exhale. "You will leave my house," James said. He was still completely calm. He had not raised his voice once. "Both of you. The men you brought with you. All of you. You will leave now, and you will not return, and any further communication regarding my wife's person or property or legal standing will go through Mr. Pruitt." "Your wife," Crow said softly, like the word tasted wrong. "My wife," James said. The 2 men looked at each other. Eleanor had the sense of watching 2 entirely different kinds of power face each other across 6 feet of floor. Crow's power, which was the power of a man who had learned to operate in the gaps of the law, to use official process as a weapon to make women disappear quietly through mechanisms that looked from outside like care and concern. And James's power, which was simpler and harder, and not derived from anything except the fact that he meant every word he said and was fully prepared to back them. Crow looked at Eleanor. "You think this is over?" he said. "I think you have a court date in Baltimore in 3 weeks, Eleanor said. "I think you should spend the time between now and then speaking with a very good attorney. And I think you should pray that Louise Prentice's family has not yet seen what we intend to present to the court." Something moved across Crow's face. For the first time it looked like fear. He turned and walked out. Silas stood for a moment longer, looking at Eleanor with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Anger, certainly, but underneath it, something else. Something that might have been shame if he'd been a different kind of man, or might have been calculation if he was the kind she suspected. "You've ruined yourself," he said. "Marrying a stranger, running from your family. No decent society will receive you." Eleanor looked at her uncle. "Uncle Silas," she said quietly, "I was raised in your house. I know exactly what the word family means when you say it. And I know what society receives women like me when men like you are done with us." She held his gaze. "I'll take my chances." He left. The door closed. The front hall of Ashford Hall was suddenly very quiet. Mrs. Reed appeared from the direction of the kitchen where she had clearly been standing close enough to hear everything. With 2 cups of tea, she had obviously prepared in advance as something to do with her hands. She held one out to Eleanor. Eleanor took it. Her hands were completely steady. She hadn't noticed until this moment that they were. Pruitt said from the stairs, "That went better than I expected." "It's not over," James said. "No," Pruitt agreed. "But the ground has shifted. The filing is on record. He can't suppress it now. Whatever he tries in the next 3 weeks, he's doing it on terrain we chose." He came the rest of the way down the stairs. "I need to get back to Baltimore and begin preparing the full presentation for the hearing. I'll send word the moment there's movement from his side." He shook James's hand. He turned to Eleanor, and for a moment he did something she hadn't expected. He looked at her with what she could only call genuine feeling, the kind that breaks through professional reserve for just a second before being recalled. "Your mother would have been proud of you," he said. Eleanor pressed her lips together. "She would have been terrified," she said, "and then proud." Pruitt smiled. "Yes, probably in that order." He left. Mrs. Reed set the second cup of tea on the hall table and retreated to the kitchen with the tact of a woman who understood that some moments needed space. Eleanor and James stood in the quiet hall. She could hear her own breathing. She could feel the teacup warm against both palms and the weight of the last 2 hours settling slowly through her like something enormous moving to a lower place. "You're shaking," James said. "I know," she said. "I'm all right." "I know you are," he said. And then after a pause, "You were extraordinary." She looked at him. She wanted to say something dismissive, that it was simply necessary, that she'd had no choice, that anyone would have done the same. She had a lifetime of practice at minimizing herself in exactly that way. She didn't do it. "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "You were extraordinary anyway." She looked down at the teacup. "James," she said. "Yes, thank you." She said it plainly, without qualification. Not for today, for all of it. for pulling me out from under your carriage seat and not sending me back, for believing enough of what I said to want to know the rest." She looked up at him. "I know this isn't what you planned for your life. I know I arrived uninvited, and I know that what lies ahead is still. I know the hearing isn't decided, and I know that Crow isn't finished, and I know that—" "Eleanor," James said. She stopped. "I know what I agreed to," he said. "I know what I said in that chapel this morning. I said it freely. Whatever comes next, we face it the same way we faced this afternoon." Something moved in his expression, something he allowed through the careful reserve for just a moment. "You are not a burden I'm managing. I want you to understand that." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "I'm beginning to," she said. Outside, the summer sun was moving toward late afternoon, long and gold and relentless, pressing through the windows of Ashford Hall with the particular insistence of a season that was not yet done with any of them. Somewhere in Baltimore, Samuel Pruitt was already writing. Somewhere in Fredericksburg, Nathaniel Crow was recalculating, and in the front hall of a house that was slowly beginning to feel like something more than shelter, Eleanor Whitfield. Eleanor Ashford now, by law and by choice, drank her tea and stayed standing and did not look away from what was coming. She was ready. She had been ready since Wednesday. 3 weeks was a long time to wait when you knew a man like Nathaniel Crow was spending every hour of it looking for a way to undo what you'd built. Eleanor knew it. James knew it. Pruitt had said it plainly in his last letter. He is not idle. We should not be either. They weren't. The days between the confrontation at Ashford Hall and the Baltimore hearing had a particular quality, tense and purposeful, like the hours before a storm, when the air changes and every living thing knows something is coming and goes about its business anyway. Eleanor and James worked. Pruitt worked. Mrs. Reed, who had no official role in any of it, but had appointed herself its moral center, sat at the kitchen table every evening and listened to the day's developments with the focused attention of a woman who had something personal at stake in the outcome, which she did. They all did. Eleanor reviewed the documents with Pruitt's clerk, a young man named Thomas, who came twice a week from Baltimore and wrote everything down in a hand even more precise than Pruitt's. She went through every letter, every date, every figure connected to her mother's trust, building the kind of record that didn't leave room for alternative interpretation. She had spent her life being told that she was too emotional, too sensitive, too much, and she had decided some time ago, probably in the kitchen garden in the rain 2 years ago, that the answer to that particular accusation was not to become less, but to become more precise, more documented, more irrefutable. James handled the practical infrastructure, the witnesses Pruitt needed located, and willing to travel the communication with the Baltimore court, the quiet management of a household that was now operating as something between a legal office and a sanctuary. He did it the way he did everything, without drama, without complaint, with the steady, focused energy of a man who had decided what mattered and was getting on with it. They saw each other at breakfast, at dinner, in the evenings, sometimes when the work was done enough that sitting still felt possible in the study with books or documents, or simply the comfortable, careful quiet that had grown between them over weeks of proximity. Eleanor was aware more than she wanted to be of how accustomed she had become to that quiet, to the specific sound of him in the house, the particular weight of his presence at the other end of the table. She was aware of it, the way you become aware of something only when you're in danger of losing it, and she was trying to be sensible about that, trying to keep her footing in a situation that had more than enough complication without her adding to it. She was not entirely succeeding, but she was trying. The letter from Pruitt arrived on a Monday 10 days before the hearing, and Eleanor knew from the way James read it, the slight pause, the controlled stillness, that it was not good news. "Tell me," she said. He set it on the table. "Crow has filed a counterpetition. He's found a judge in Fredericksburg willing to hear his competency claim despite our Baltimore filing. He's arguing jurisdictional priority, that because you were a resident of Fredericksburg County at the time of your departure, the county court has precedence." Eleanor looked at the letter. Can he win that argument? Pruitt says it's weak but not impossible. If the Fredericksburg judge moves quickly and issues a ruling before Baltimore hears our petition, It could create a conflict of jurisdiction that slows everything down. James's jaw tightened. Crow doesn't need to win outright. He only needs to delay long enough. Long enough for September 14th, Eleanor said. Yes, she absorbed that. The date that had been in the back of her mind for weeks, her 28th birthday, the day the trust transferred outright to her, the day that was supposed to make all of this resolved, was suddenly a deadline of a different kind. If Crow could manufacture enough legal confusion, enough competing jurisdictions and conflicting filings and procedural complications, he could potentially have her declared incompetent before the trust transferred, locking it into a custody arrangement that would survive her birthday entirely. She had underestimated him. No, she had understood him correctly. She had simply not anticipated that he would have this many tools left. "What does Pruitt recommend?" she said. "He wants to move the Baltimore hearing forward. Request an emergency session based on the jurisdictional threat." James folded the letter. But he needs something to justify emergency status. He needs to show the court that there is imminent harm, that delay is not simply inconvenient, but genuinely dangerous. "Louise Prentice," Eleanor said immediately. James looked at her. "She died in that institution," Eleanor said. "That is not a theoretical harm. That is what happens when this process is allowed to complete. Pruitt needs to put that in front of the Baltimore court and make them understand that I am not a legal abstraction. I am a woman with a specific deadline, and a man who has already done this once." Her voice was steady. "I will go to Baltimore. I will testify before the hearing if I need to. I will stand in front of that judge myself and make him understand." James was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do that yet," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'm choosing to." He looked at her with that expression she had come to recognize, the one where his reserve cracked just slightly, along an edge where something real showed through before he recalled it. "All right," he said. "I'll write to Pruitt today." The response came in 2 days. The Baltimore court granted an expedited hearing based on the Prentice precedent. The date was set for Thursday of the following week. They would have 1 day, 1 hearing, 1 opportunity to put everything in front of a judge who had no connection to Crow, no existing relationship with the Whitfield family, and no particular interest in protecting the reputation of a Fredericksburg magistrate. One day, Eleanor spent the night before the hearing awake for most of it, not in panic. She had moved past panic somewhere in the second week at Ashford Hall, but in the particular wakefulness of someone running through every possible version of the next day, stress testing every argument, every document, every moment where something could go wrong. At some point, close to 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep, put on her robe, and went downstairs to the kitchen. James was already there. He was sitting at the work table with a cup of cold coffee and the expression of a man who had also abandoned sleep some hours ago. He looked up when she came in. He didn't say anything about the hour. "Coffee's cold," he said. "I can make more." "Don't bother," she said, and sat down across from him. They sat in the dark kitchen for a moment. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "It means you're taking it seriously." "I've been taking it seriously since Wednesday," she said. And then, because it was 3 in the morning, and she was tired enough to be honest, "I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing. I'm afraid of standing in front of that judge and having him look at me the way men like Crow look at me, like I'm a problem to be categorized, and not being able to make him see past it." James looked at her across the table. "He will look at you," he said, "and he will see a woman who walked through 20 feet of legal fire without losing her footing, and who has more documented evidence against her opponent than most cases see in their lifetime." He paused. "Don't try to make him like you. Make him unable to argue with you. You're better at that anyway." Eleanor looked at him. "You've been paying attention," she said. "From the beginning," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "James, when this is over, when the hearing is done and the trust is secured and Crow is dealt with, what do you want?" He was very still. "What do you mean?" he said. "I mean, we made an arrangement," she said. "A marriage of protection, and you told me it could be whatever I needed it to be. And I am asking you now at 3 in the morning, when neither of us is performing anything for anyone, what you want. Not what you're willing to offer, what you actually want. The kitchen was completely quiet. James looked at his coffee cup for a long moment. Then he looked at her. I want this, he said. Whatever this is, you at my table, you in my house. Your voice in the morning before I've had enough coffee to be reasonable about anything. He stopped. I want it to be real. I know that isn't what we agreed to. I know that you came to me in a desperate situation, and I know the terms we set, and I am not... He stopped again. I'm not asking you to change the arrangement. I'm answering your question honestly because you asked for honesty, and that's what I have. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. I'm not ready to say everything I want to say, she said finally. Not tonight. Tonight I need to be able to think clearly tomorrow morning. I know, he said. But I want you to know, she said, that what I said in that chapel, I said it freely, and not only because the law required it. James was very still. All right, he said quietly. All right, she said. They sat in the dark kitchen until the sky outside began to lighten, and neither of them said anything else, and it was one of the most honest silences Eleanor had ever sat inside. The Baltimore courthouse was full. Eleanor had not expected that. She had expected a formal quiet proceeding, a judge, the attorneys, the documents, the witnesses. She had not expected the number of people who had apparently decided that this hearing was worth attending. Pruitt noticed her surprise. Word travels, he said quietly as they made their way through. 3 of the women whose families were affected by Morse's previous testimony are here. The Prentice family sent a representative. There are 2 journalists. He looked at her. You're not just fighting for your trust, Mrs. Ashford. You've become something larger than that, whether you intended to or not. Eleanor looked at the room. She thought of her mother, who had trusted the arrangements of men with good names and died with nothing she'd intended to keep. She thought of Louise Prentice, 24 years old, gone. Good, she said. Crow was already there. He had a different attorney now, a man named Hargrove, who had the expensive, polished look of someone retained specifically to project authority. Silas Whitfield sat beside them. He looked older than he had at Ashford Hall, Eleanor thought. Diminished. The particular diminishment of a man who is beginning to understand that the story is going in a direction he cannot control. The judge, a man named Alderman Walsh, was in his late 60s, with a face like weathered timber and eyes that were. Eleanor decided immediately not stupid. That was good. Stupid judges were more dangerous than sharp ones in situations like this, because they compensated for uncertainty with deference to authority, and Crow was very good at projecting authority. Walsh was not going to be deferential. Pruitt made his opening argument with the precise, unhurried confidence of a man who had done this many times and knew exactly which details to lead with and which to hold. He laid out the timeline, the letters, the arrangement between Crow and Silas, the Morse connection, the Beaumont Institution. He said Louise Prentice's name clearly and let the silence after it do its work. Hargrove objected twice. Walsh sustained neither. Then Hargrove made his argument that Eleanor's flight from the estate on the morning of her wedding was itself evidence of instability, that her entry into a carriage uninvited suggested disordered thinking, that her subsequent agreement to a rapid marriage barely 2 weeks after meeting James Ashford was the action of a woman who was not reasoning clearly. Eleanor sat and listened to her own life being described as a symptom. She had been told to remain calm. She remained calm. Walsh looked at Hargrove. You're describing a woman who made a series of rapid decisions under extreme pressure, he said. That's not instability. That's urgency. Those are different things, counselor. Hargrove pivoted. He called Dr. Harlan Morse. Morse was a small, precise man who entered the witness chair with the manner of someone who had done this before, which he had 3 times successfully. He testified in careful clinical language about the indicators of hysteria and mental incompetence, and he referenced Eleanor's departure from the estate and her subsequent behavior as consistent with a pattern he had observed and documented. Pruitt cross-examined. "Dr. Morse," he said pleasantly, "you testified in the competency hearing of a Mrs. Ann Carroll in 1813. Correct. Yes. And in the hearing of a Miss Frances Osgood in 1814. Yes. And a Mrs. Ruth Blythe in 1815. Yes. In all three cases you testified that the subject was incompetent." "In all three cases that was my professional assessment. In all three cases, the subject was a woman with a property interest that transferred to a male relative or creditor following the hearing." Hargrove was on his feet. "Objection." "I'm asking about a pattern," Pruitt said. "The court can assess its significance." Walsh looked at Morse. "You may answer." Morse's careful manner had developed a quality of stillness. "The financial arrangements of the subjects were not relevant to my assessments." "Were you aware," Pruitt said, "that in the case of Louise Prentice Crowe, not a hearing in which you testified, but a case involving the same Mr. Crowe who engaged your services in this matter, Mrs. Crowe was committed to the Beaumont Institution in 1812 and died there in 1813. The room shifted. Morse said, "I have no connection to that case." "No." Pruitt agreed. "But Mr. Crowe does. And the pattern of his behavior engaging a cooperative physician, pursuing a competency hearing and profiting from the subsequent arrangement is documented in 3 of your 4 cases and is alleged in this one." He looked at Walsh. "Your Honor, I submit that Dr. Morse's testimony reflects a professional practice that has been made available to men willing to pay for a particular outcome, and I ask the court to weigh it accordingly." Walsh looked at Morse for a long moment. Morse said nothing. Walsh said, "I've seen enough. We'll hear from Mrs. Ashford." Eleanor stood. She walked to the front of the room, and she did not let herself look at Crowe because she knew that if she looked at him, she would feel the full weight of what he had tried to do to her, and she could not carry that weight and speak clearly at the same time, and speaking clearly was what mattered. She looked at Walsh. She told the truth. She told it without embellishment and without performance, in the same plain direct voice she had used at 3 in the morning in a dark kitchen. The voice that was simply herself without the careful management she had practiced her whole life. She told him about the note, about the 8 minutes, about the carriage at Callaway's Crossroads and the man who had not sent her back, about the letters and Mrs. Reed and Louise Prentice's name in a county record, and what it meant to be a woman with a trust coming due, and a man who had already done this once and was prepared to do it again. She told him what the word institution meant when it was used as a weapon. Walsh listened. He did not look at her the way Nathaniel Crowe looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks when he is paying attention because what he is hearing matters. When she was done, the room was very quiet. Hargrove said, "Your Honor, the witness has presented an emotional account, but the legal question remains." "The legal question," Walsh said, "is whether this woman is competent. I've been watching and listening for 2 hours. She is manifestly competent. The question I'm more interested in is whether the petition against her was brought in good faith, and on that question I have significant doubts." He looked at Crowe. "Mr. Crowe, I am going to be reviewing the documents submitted by Mr. Pruitt with considerable attention." Crowe met Walsh's gaze. For just a moment, Eleanor saw it again. The fear she'd seen in the front hall of Ashford Hall, underneath the calculation and the smooth professional manner. The fear of a man who is used to moving in the gaps of the law and has just discovered that this particular gap has closed. Walsh called a recess. Eleanor walked back to her seat. James was in the row behind the attorney's table. He had not been permitted to sit at the table itself. He was not a party, not a witness, simply her husband. Which was a strange and new thing for a man accustomed to being at the center of every room he was in. He had sat there for 2 hours with the focused stillness Eleanor recognized as his version of intense feeling, and when she sat down and turned slightly, he met her eyes. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. She turned back to face the front of the room. 20 minutes later, Walsh returned. He denied the competency petition in full. He cited the documented evidence of financial motive. He cited the pattern established by Dr. Morse's prior testimony. He noted the death of Louise Prentice and ordered that the connection to Crow be reviewed by the appropriate authorities. He affirmed Eleanor's legal competency, her right to her trust, effective September 14th, and the validity of her marriage. He looked at Crow as he read the final order, and said in the voice of a man who chooses his words with the care of someone who will have to stand behind them, "This court does not look favorably on the use of medical and legal process as instruments of financial predation. If the review I have ordered returns findings consistent with what has been presented today, this matter will have consequences considerably beyond this petition." Crow stood. For one moment, something crossed his face. Not contrition, not remorse, but a kind of terrifying blankness, the expression of a man from whom something he believed was permanent has just been removed. He walked out without speaking. Silas Whitfield sat for a moment longer. Then he rose and followed without once looking at Eleanor, which was the most honest thing he had done in her presence in years. The room began to breathe again. Mrs. Reed, seated 2 rows back, pressed her handkerchief to her mouth and made a sound she would deny if asked about it later. Pruitt turned from the attorney's table and looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who rarely permits himself satisfaction, but is currently making an exception. "September 14th, he said. "It's yours." Eleanor pressed her hands flat against her knees. She thought of her mother. She thought of Louise Prentice. She thought of a note written in careful slanted letters by a woman who was afraid and wrote it anyway. She thought of 8 minutes and a dark green carriage and a man who had not sent her back. She stood up. She turned around. James was already on his feet. She crossed the 2 steps between them, and he took her hand. Not a formal gesture, not the careful distance he had maintained for weeks, but something direct and real and unperformed, and she held on. "It's over," she said. "The worst of it," he said. Outside the courthouse, the summer sun pressed down on Baltimore, with everything it had left thick and golden and relentless, the particular insistence of a season nearing its end and not yet ready to admit it. Eleanor stood in it and let it hit her face. She was not a runaway bride anymore. She was not a ward, not a transaction, not a problem to be categorized and contained. She was a woman who had run for her life and built something worth running toward, and there was still one more thing left to do. The ride back from Baltimore was quieter than the ride in. Not an uncomfortable quiet. The kind that comes after something enormous has moved through and left the air different in its wake, cleaner, somehow changed in a way that doesn't require commentary. Mrs. Reed fell asleep against the carriage window 20 minutes outside the city, which Eleanor took as the most honest possible verdict on the day. The woman had been running on fear and determination for 2 weeks. She had earned the right to stop. James sat across from Eleanor and looked out the window and didn't say much, and Eleanor looked at her hands in her lap and didn't say much either, and the carriage rolled north through the late afternoon heat, and somewhere in the silence between them, a thing settled that hadn't been settled before. Something that didn't have a name yet, but had weight, real weight. The kind you feel in your chest when something that was uncertain becomes certain, and you're still adjusting to the shape of it. When they were about an hour from Ashford Hall, James said without looking away from the window, "What are you thinking?" Eleanor considered the question honestly. "I'm thinking about my mother," she said. "I keep doing that. Every time something resolves, I think about her, whether she would have what she would say." "What do you think she would say?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "She would say I was reckless. She would say I could have gotten myself killed or worse." She looked at him. "And then she would say she was proud of me. In that order. She was always honest about the fear before she got to the rest of it." James looked at her. "She sounds like someone worth being proud of yourself." "She was," Eleanor said simply. Outside, the light was going gold and long, the specific quality of late summer afternoon that feels like a permission, like the day is finally letting go of its insistence and allowing things to be softer. Eleanor watched it through the glass and let herself feel for the first time in weeks something that was not urgency. It was strange. She had been running on urgency for so long that the absence of it felt almost like a physical sensation, a loosening, a kind of spaciousness, as if her lungs had more room than she'd remembered giving them. She thought about what she had said at 3 in the morning in the dark kitchen. She thought about what he had said back. She thought there is still one more thing left to do. Not the trust, not the court, not Crow or her uncle or any of the legal machinery that had consumed the past 3 weeks. The thing between herself and James Ashford that had been carefully mutually, almost deliberately, left unfinished because they had both agreed without saying it that it needed to wait until the crisis was resolved. Until neither of them could be accused of feeling things under pressure that they wouldn't feel in the clear. The crisis was resolved. She looked across the carriage. He was already looking at her. "James," she said. "I know," he said. "I haven't said it yet." "I know that too." She held his gaze. "I'm going to say it when we're home," she said. "When we're standing still and there's no hearing and no petition and no carriage moving underneath us. I want to say it with my feet on solid ground." Something moved in his expression, the particular quality of a man who is exercising considerable patience because he has decided it is worth it. "All right," he said. Mrs. Reed shifted in her sleep and murmured something indistinct. Eleanor almost smiled. "Tomorrow," she said. "I'll hold you to that," he said. But that night, the fire started. It began in the kitchen, a grease fire, the kind that happens in summer heat when a house has been neglected for an evening because everyone in it was exhausted from a courthouse. Mrs. Greer had left something on the hearth. She was the first to smell it, the first to raise the alarm, and her voice came up through the house at 9:30 with a force that brought everyone to their feet. Eleanor was in the guest room. She had kept the guest room by unspoken mutual agreement during the weeks of the arrangement, maintaining the careful distance that had seemed right when the marriage was primarily legal, and she came out into the corridor before she was fully awake, and the smell hit her, and her body understood it before her mind did. She moved toward the stairs. The smoke was already in the upstairs hall, not thick yet, but present the particular acrid smell of a kitchen fire, finding its way through a house, the way fire always does, looking for room to grow. She could hear Mrs. Greer below, and Thomas the clerk, who had been staying the week, and the sound of water and movement, and controlled panic. She was 2 steps from the staircase, when the door at the end of the hall opened, and James came through it at a pace that was nearly running, and when he saw her, he stopped. He stopped completely. For just a second, 1 second, something crossed his face that had nothing to do with the fire. Something unguarded and immediate, the expression of a man who had been afraid of something specific and has just seen that it hasn't happened. Then he crossed the hall in 4 steps and took her by both arms. "Are you all right?" he said. Not a question, a demand. "I'm fine," she said. "I just woke up." "What?" "Kitchen fire. It's being handled. Come downstairs." He didn't release her arms. He was looking at her with that same expression, the one she hadn't seen before. Not the careful reserve, not the controlled consideration, but something underneath all of that, something he had been keeping below the surface with considerable effort. "James," she said. "I'm all right." "I know," he said. "I know you are. I just—" He stopped. His hands were still on her arms, and she could feel that they were not entirely steady. "I heard Mrs. Greer and I thought you were on this end of the hall, and the fire was—" "I'm here," she said. "I'm standing right here." He looked at her, and then he said it not the way she had expected it, not with the careful, measured delivery of a man who has prepared what he wants to say, but the way a man speaks when something has stripped the preparation away and left only the thing underneath. "I married you to protect your life," he said. "That was the truth when I said it, and I meant every word of it. But somewhere in the past 3 weeks, somewhere between 3 in the morning in the kitchen and that courthouse today, your life became the one thing I cannot imagine mine without." His voice was steady, but only barely. "I need you to know that. I needed to say it before." He stopped. "I needed to say it." Eleanor looked at him. Her feet were on solid ground. They were not in a carriage. There was no hearing tomorrow, no petition, No crisis, requiring her to keep every feeling carefully managed and every word precisely chosen. "I love you," she said. "I know we agreed I'd say it tomorrow. I know I said solid ground and I meant it. But you're standing here with your hands on my arms, and you just told me the truest thing anyone has said to me in years, and I am not going to make you wait until morning." She looked directly at him. "I love you. It is not gratitude, and it is not proximity, and it is not the result of being desperate and afraid, and in need of rescue. It is the result of watching who you are for 3 weeks, and finding that I trust it. All of it. Every quiet and careful part of it." James was very still. Then he said, "Eleanor." "Yes," she said. "I love you too," he said. "I have for some time. I didn't want to say it until you were free enough to choose what to do with it." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm choosing," she said. He pulled her toward him, and she let him. And they stood in the smoky upstairs corridor of Ashford Hall, with the fire being handled somewhere below them, and the summer night pressing in at the windows, and Eleanor felt something complete itself that she had not known was incomplete, something that had been waiting patient and certain since the moment a man had looked at her on the floor of his carriage and offered her his hand. From below, Mrs. Greer's voice rose, "The fire is out. Everyone can come down now." Mrs. Reed, emerging from her own room at the far end of the hall with her hair loose and her robe on, and an expression of enormous dignity in deeply undignified circumstances, looked at the two of them standing together in the corridor and said without missing a beat, "About time." September 14th arrived on a Tuesday. Eleanor stood at the window of the East Study, the study she had organized 3 weeks ago, the one that no longer had papers on every surface, the one that now had 2 chairs on the same side of the desk, and watched the morning come in and thought about the woman who had torn a wedding dress off and stepped over it 7 weeks ago with $40 and a pearl brooch and 8 minutes. She did not feel like that woman anymore. She felt like a woman who had made something out of nothing, which was harder and more specific and considerably more satisfying. The trust transferred without drama. Pruitt sent a letter confirming the legal completion written in his compact, precise hand, with a single line at the bottom that was not quite formal and not quite personal, but somewhere in the narrow space between, "Your mother would have taken considerable pleasure in this outcome. I did too." Eleanor set the letter on the desk and went to find James. But September was only the beginning. What Eleanor did next was the thing that no one had scripted for her, which was exactly the point. She sat down with Pruitt in the first week of October and told him what she wanted to do with the trust. Not all of it she was not impractical, and she understood that money needed tending, or it became its own kind of danger, but a portion of it enough to matter. She wanted to fund a school. Not a fashionable school for girls who already had every advantage, but a working school one that taught letters and figures and practical law. The kind of knowledge that would have mattered to her mother. The kind that might have mattered to Louise Prentice. The kind that allowed a woman to understand what was being done to her and have words for it. She wanted to fund legal aid for widows contesting estate decisions. She had sat with Pruitt long enough to understand that what had happened to her was not uncommon. It was simply usually quieter, usually uncontested, usually resolved in the direction of the men, because the women didn't have an Abigail Reed or a Samuel Pruitt or a Carriage at a crossroads to hide inside. She wanted to establish a fund for domestic workers dismissed without reference, women turned out of households with nothing, no recourse, no record of their service, made invisible by the same mechanisms that had nearly made Eleanor invisible. Pruitt listened to all of it. Then he said, "That is a considerable undertaking for a woman who has been married 8 weeks. 10 weeks by the time we file," Eleanor said. "Does the law have a problem with it?" "The law," Pruitt said, "has no problem with it whatsoever. Your husband, my husband," Eleanor said, "helped me draft 3 of the funding proposals." Pruitt looked at her over his spectacles for a moment. "I'll begin the paperwork," he said. James had not only helped draft the proposals. He had done something Eleanor had not asked for, and had not expected, which was to speak publicly. There was a gathering in Baltimore in November. Not a grand formal affair, but a working dinner for merchants. 2 judges, a county alderman, and several attorneys, who Pruitt had been cultivating for years as men of reasonable conscience. James had attended these dinners for years. He was known there, respected his word, carrying the particular weight of a man who had accumulated it slowly and spent it rarely. He stood up at that dinner. Eleanor had not known he was going to. She found out from Pruitt afterward, who told it to her in the kitchen at Ashford Hall, with the expression of a man who had witnessed something and wanted to report it accurately. James had stood up and told them about Eleanor. Not everything. Not the intimate things. Not the private things that belonged only between the 2 of them. But the structure of it. The mechanism. The way law and medicine and money had been arranged against a woman with the specific intention of erasing her. The name Louise Prentice. The way competency hearings were being used as financial instruments. The fact that it had worked once completely lethally and had almost worked again. And then, he said, Pruitt told it to her carefully, wanting to get the words right. This is not a story about one man's cruelty. It is a story about the gaps we leave because we do not look closely enough at who falls through them. Eleanor did not need a husband. She needed a system that did not require a husband for protection. We should be working toward that system. We are not there. I am telling you so you know. The room had been quiet when he sat down. Then the alderman had said, "What does your wife propose?" And James had said, "Ask her. She'll tell you better than I can." 2 weeks later, Eleanor attended the next dinner herself. She sat at that table and she told them what she proposed, what it would cost, what it would return. Not in money, which was the only currency most of them were accustomed to counting, but in women who knew their rights, in children, who could read their own contracts, in widows, who could contest arrangements made against them without needing to find a carriage to hide inside. Some of them shifted in their seats. Some of them asked questions she answered directly. One of them, a judge named Harmon Older, with the kind of face that gives nothing away, waited until everyone else was done, and then said, "Mrs. Ashford, what made you think you had the right to fight back?" Eleanor looked at him. "I didn't think about rights," she said. "I thought about what would happen if I didn't, and that was enough." Judge Harmon looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'd like to make a contribution to the school fund." Mrs. Reed did not go back to Richmond. Eleanor had not asked her to stay. She had offered, carefully aware that Mrs. Reed was a woman who made her own choices and did not need managing. Mrs. Reed had looked at the offer for approximately 2 seconds and said, "The school will need someone to run it when you're occupied with everything else. I was a governess for 22 years. I know what girls need to learn." She was right. She always had been. By December, the school had 12 girls enrolled, ranging from 8 to 17 daughters of working families in Baltimore, who had practical intelligence and no access to the kind of knowledge that would let them use it. Mrs. Reed ran the morning sessions with the focused precision of a woman who had been waiting for this specific work her whole life without knowing it. Eleanor ran the afternoon legal sessions herself, plain language practical cases, what the law said and what it meant, and where it fell short, and what you could do about the falling short. It was the best 2 hours of her week, every week. On a Wednesday afternoon in late December, Eleanor was in the East Study, going over the quarterly accounts for the school fund, when James came in and set a cup of tea on the desk beside her, without being asked, which was something he had started doing sometime in October and had not stopped. She looked up at him. "Pruitt sent a letter," he said. She waited. "Crow has been indicted," James said. The review Walsh ordered came back. The Prentice family had kept records letters Louise wrote from the institution in the months before she died. A physician there kept his own notes separate from the official record. "Pruitt believes the charge will be sustained." Eleanor set down her pen. She thought about Louise Prentice, 24 years old, writing letters from an institution that no one was supposed to know she was in. Writing them to someone, some careful person who had kept them for 4 years, waiting for a moment when they might matter. They mattered now. "And Morse," Eleanor said. "His medical license is under review. Pruitt expects it to be revoked by spring." Eleanor looked at the window. "My uncle, publicly disgraced. He sold the Whitfield estate last month to cover his debts. He's in Richmond." James paused. "Pruitt says he's not in a position to cause any further damage." Eleanor nodded slowly. She did not feel triumph exactly. Triumph was too simple for this. What she felt was closer to completion, the particular quiet of a story reaching the end it should have reached of justice, moving even slowly in the right direction. She thought of her mother. She thought, "This one's for you." She picked up her pen. Then she set it down again and looked at James, who was watching her with the expression she had come to know best. The one where the reserve was down and the real thing was visible, steady and certain, and entirely his own. "James," she said. "Yes." "Are you happy?" He considered it the way he considered everything, seriously, without performance. "Yes," he said. "I am." "Are you?" Eleanor looked around the study. The organized papers, the two chairs on the same side of the desk, the cup of tea he had set beside her without being asked. She thought about 8 minutes and a dark green carriage and a man who had not sent her back. She thought about everything she had built since then. Not because anyone handed it to her. Not because the law protected her. Not because she had been rescued. Because she had run when she needed to run and fought when she needed to fight, and chosen freely and clearly every step that came after. "Yes," she said. "I am." Outside, the December air was cold and sharp and clear, and inside Ashford Hall a fire burned steadily in the hearth, and the school would open again in the morning, and the trust was in Eleanor's name, and the woman who had stepped over her wedding dress like a grave marker had built something from the ground up that no man could sell, no court could take, and no institution could contain. She had not escaped to survive. She had escaped to become. And she had become exactly who she intended.